The wind carried a dry whisper across the wide plains, a sound that always seemed older than the land itself. It was the kind of silence that only the frontier knew, broken only by the steady creak of saddle leather, the call of a crow, or the sharp crack of a rifle. For settlers and ranchers, this land was promise and peril wrapped into one. A place where a man's future could be built from nothing, but where every step carried a risk. And on one fateful day, single moment of misjudgment set into motion a story that no one could have predicted. The rancher had lived on that stretch of earth for years. He wasn't a man of great wealth, but he worked the soil with calloused hands and tended his cattle with the patience of someone who knew. Survival depended on routine. Life was simple but harsh, balanced between the relentless sun and the open prairie. He had heard stories about the Apache people, about their fierce pride, their deep bond with the land, and the mistrust that had grown between them and the settlers who pushed further west each year. Too many ranchers, the Apache were seen as strangers to be wary of, sometimes even as a threat. But to him, they were simply part of the world he had chosen to live in, a world where lines blurred and chance encounters could change everything. On that afternoon, the rancher wasn't looking for trouble. He was out checking his fences, riding along the edge of his property as the light began to fade. The prairie was quiet, the kind of quiet that tricks the mind into thinking it's safe. But then, a rustle in the brush caught his ear. He thought it was a coyote, maybe even a thief, creeping along the fence line. In a heartbeat, his instincts took over. He raised his rifle, squeezed the trigger, and in the echo that rolled across the plains, his world shifted forever. Instead of a coyote, instead of an intruder, a young Apache boy stumbled into the open. The shot had struck him. The boy collapsed, his face pale with shock, his eyes wide with fear and pain. The rifle slipped from the rancher's hands as if it had turned to fire in his grip. He rushed forward, his heart pounding louder than the fading echo of the gunshot. The boy could not have been more than 15. He wasn't armed with anything but a small bow, a hunter's tool, not a warrior's weapon. In that instant, the rancher realized the full weight of his mistake. Panic flooded his chest. He knew the danger wasn't only in what had just happened, but in what would surely come after. If the boy's family found him here, injured by a settler's bullet, it could spark something far bigger than one man's accident. Tension between the Apache and ranchers had been smoldering for years, each side wary of the other. One spark, one death could turn that wariness into fire. And he had just pulled the trigger that could ignite it. But instead of running, instead of leaving the boy where he fell, the rancher did something no one expected. He dropped to his knees, tore strips of cloth from his own shirt, and pressed them against the wound. His hands shook, not only from fear, but from a strange resolve that rose inside him. He could not undo what had happened, but he could choose what to do next. Saving the boy became his only thought, his only chance to right the wrong that had fallen on both of them. The boy's breathing was shallow, his dark eyes flickered between pain and mistrust. He didn't cry out, didn't speak, only stared at the man who had shot him. There was something unspoken in that looks, something that made the rancher's chest tighten. This wasn't just about life or death. This was about two worlds colliding, two ways of life that had never learned to trust each other. And here, in the dust of the prairie, the decision of one rancher could change everything. The rancher lifted the boy gently, placing him across the saddle. Every step back to his cabin felt heavier than the last. He thought about what would happen if the Apache found him with their injured son. He thought about the blood feud that could rise, about his own family's safety, about whether he was marching toward his own end. Yet, despite it all, he pressed on, each stride of his horse carrying him closer to the unknown. That night, under the flicker of lantern light, the rancher worked desperately to stop the bleeding. His hands weren't trained, his supplies were meager, but he worked as though his own life depended on it. And perhaps it did. He whispered words the boy could not understand, hoping somehow the sound of his voice might calm him. As the hours passed, the boy drifted in and out of consciousness, his breaths shallow but steady. The rancher fought sleep, fought despair, clinging to the fragile thread of hope that he might keep the boy alive until morning, but dawn would bring more than light. Somewhere out there, the boy's family would be searching. They would find the trail. They would know what had happened. And when they arrived, they would see their son in the home of the very man who had nearly taken his life. What they chose to do then would not only decide the rancher's fate, but could ripple across the fragile balance of peace between settlers and Apache. The rancher knew he could hide the boy. He could flee, or he could face whatever came with honesty. It was a choice that burned in his chest as the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and silent, but the silence was heavy now, waiting to be broken. Every hoofbeat in the distance, every shadow on the horizon, felt like a reckoning approaching. And when the knock came at his door, when the shapes appeared against the morning sun, the rancher's breath caught in his throat. The tribe had come. Their eyes carried anger, grief, and suspicion. They saw their son wounded, lying in the bed of the man who had shot him. And in that moment, the rancher knew the fate of more than just himself rested on what he had done in the long, fearful hours of the night. What he did next would not only shock the Apache, but would forever alter the bond between a rancher and a people. He had once seen only as strangers, but what exactly happened when the tribe saw their son in his care? And what choice did the rancher make that turned fear into something else entirely? That is where the story truly begins. The knock on the door echoed in the small cabin, louder than any gunshot the rancher had ever fired. He froze where he stood, hands still pressed against the boy's bandaged wound. The lantern's weak flame trembling as if it too felt the weight of what was about to happen. Outside, shadows shifted against the rising sun. He could see their shapes through the window figures standing tall, still, their silence more menacing than words. The Apache had come just as he knew they would. The boy stirred faintly, his lips parting as though to speak, but only a breath escaped him. The rancher swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had spent the night fighting to keep the boy alive. Now his fate lay in the hands of the people who had every reason to see him as an enemy. He could have hidden, he could have run. But the boy on the bed was proof that he had chosen differently. With a deep breath, he moved toward the door. His hand hovered over the wooden latch, and for a heartbeat he considered what would happen if he opened it. He pictured being dragged into the dirt, the tribe's fury unleashed on him before he could utter a single word. But he also knew leaving them outside would be worse. So he lifted the latch, and the door creaked open. 4 men stood there, his faces hard as stone, their eyes flicking past him to the cabin's interior. They saw the boy lying pale against the sheets, his chest rising weakly, the blood-soaked rags that told the story without words. Their gazes snapped back to the rancher, sharp as knives. And in that instant he knew the truth. His life hung by the thinnest thread. No one spoke at first. The silence stretched long, heavy, broken only by the ragged breathing of the boy inside. Then one of the men stepped forward, older than the rest, his hair streaked with gray. His eyes carried not only anger, but something deeper: pain, suspicion, and the kind of weariness that comes from a lifetime of defending what was his. He said something in Apache, his voice low but firm. The words were unfamiliar, but the tone needed no translation. It was a demand, not a question. The rancher raised his hands slowly, palms open, showing he carried no weapon. He tried to find words, but his voice caught in his throat. At last, he managed a broken whisper. It was a mistake, an accident. I didn't know. I didn't know it was him. The men's expressions didn't soften. If anything, they hardened. Yet none of them moved to strike him. Instead, their eyes went again to the boy. They saw the bandages, the crude care, the lantern burned down low from a night spent in vigilance. It wasn't enough to prove trust, but it was enough to keep them from ending him right there. The boy moaned faintly. One of the younger men rushed past the rancher to kneel at his side. The others followed, their voices hushed as they spoke in words the rancher could not understand. He stepped back, keeping his hands raised, his heart pounding. The gray-haired man turned to him again, and though the words that followed were foreign, the meaning was clear. The rancher could feel it in the weight of the gaze fixed upon him. This was no longer just his burden. It was now theirs. He wanted to explain, to tell them about the rustle in the brush. The split-second decision, the fear that had guided his hand. But deep down, he knew excuses would mean nothing. What mattered was not why the boy had been shot, but what had been done afterward. And what would be done now? The hours that followed stretched like days. The tribe did not leave, nor did they strike. Instead, they moved carefully, speaking among themselves in voices that carried both urgency and restraint. They allowed the rancher to stay in the room, but every time he moved, every time he shifted his weight, their eyes cut to him, watching with suspicion sharp enough to draw blood as the boy drifted between waking and sleep. The rancher found himself caught in a storm of thoughts. He remembered stories told around campfires, stories of conflict, of raids and reprisals, of blood spilled on both sides. He had never taken part in such violence, but he had lived with the knowledge that it was always close, simmering beneath the surface of uneasy peace. And now, by a twist of fate and the squeeze of a trigger, he was no longer just a rancher tending cattle. He was a man who had struck a blow against the Apache. Even if by accident, he thought of his own family, his wife, his children, and wondered if word would spread, if whispers would carry across the plains that he had shot a boy. He feared not only for himself, but for them, for the safety of his home, for whether the fragile balance of life on this land had already tipped too far. The older Apache man, the one with gray in his hair, remained close to the boy's side. From time to time, he would glance at the rancher, his face unreadable, as if weighing him against a scale no settler could ever see. Once, when the boy stirred and coughed, the man muttered a prayer under his breath. There was tenderness there, and the rancher realized with a cold sinking in his stomach that this must be the boy's kin, perhaps even his father, if so. The rancher's mistake was far greater than he had imagined. He had not just injured a youth of the tribe. He had wounded the son of a man whose voice likely carried weight among his people. The tension in the cabin was thick, pressing down on every breath. The rancher wanted to move, to speak, to do anything to break it, but he dared not. The tribe's silence was not ignorance, it was control. They were watching him, waiting, deciding. And though no one said it aloud, he understood the unspoken truth. The decision they came to would not only determine his fate, but perhaps the fate of every settler and Apache within miles of this place. Night fell again, a second since the shot rang out. The boy still breathed, though faintly, his strength caught between slipping away and clinging on. The Apache men stayed through the darkness, their presence unyielding. The rancher did not sleep, though his body begged for it. Instead, he sat against the wall, staring into the dim glow of the lantern, wondering what dawn would bring. Would they take the boy and leave, only to return with warriors ready for vengeance? Would they judge him here, in his own cabin, with no chance to plead his case? Or would they see something in what he had done, something that spoke louder than his mistake? The prairie outside lay quiet, but it was a silence filled with waiting. Every coyote's cry, every gust of wind seemed like an omen. The rancher could feel the ground shifting beneath him, not in earth and stone, but in trust and consequence. And so the night dragged on, the boy's shallow breaths marking the hours, the watchful eyes of the Apache never leaving him. Suspense hung heavy in the air, thicker than smoke. The rancher's heart ached with questions that had no answers, fear that had no outlet. What would come when the sun rose again? Would it bring justice, vengeance, or something neither side had ever expected? That was the mystery that loomed like a storm just beyond the horizon, ready to break at any moment. The rancher sat against the cabin wall, the dim glow of the lantern throwing long shadows across the room. His eyes burned from exhaustion, but he dared not close them. Every time he looked at the boy, pale and restless on the bed, he felt the weight of what he had done pressing harder on his chest. The Apache men had not left. They kept their silent vigil, their sharp eyes glinting in the half-light, their expressions unreadable. It was as if the air itself was caught between breaths, waiting for a decision no one was ready to make. The older man, with streaks of gray in his hair, rarely moved from the boy's side. The rancher had begun to notice the way his hand lingered near the boy's shoulder, how his eyes softened for the briefest moments before hardening again when they shifted toward him. There was something deeply personal in that gaze, something that confirmed what the rancher had feared, that this was no ordinary youth. The boy mattered not just to his family, but perhaps to the entire tribe. His survival, or his death, could tip a fragile balance. From time to time, the younger men whispered among themselves, their voices low, urgent, and in words the rancher could not understand. He could only read tone and expression. Anger simmered in those whispers, suspicion sharp and clear. Their glances at him were like daggers, as though they were deciding whether to strike now or wait until the boy's fate was certain. Yet despite the tension, they never touched their weapons. Something held them back, perhaps the boy's fragile condition, or perhaps the older man's authority. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and silent, but it was not empty. The rancher knew others were out there. The rest of the tribe would not be far behind. If word spread that a settler had shot a boy, accident or not, the situation could spiral into bloodshed. And if settlers caught wind of Apache warriors gathering, they too would prepare for conflict. The rancher's cabin, small and fragile on the edge of the plains, had become the center of a storm. The rancher's mind raced with fear, but beneath it all, a stubborn thread of resolve wound itself tighter. He thought back to the moment after he pulled the trigger, when he saw the boy collapse, when he realized the terrible mistake he had made. He could have fled. He could have left the boy to die. But he hadn't. That mattered, he told himself. Had to. Whether it mattered enough to the Apache was another question entirely. As the hours passed, the boy's breathing grew shallower. His eyelids fluttered, his lips moved, whispering words too faint to hear. The older man leaned close, listening, and for the first time the rancher saw raw fear in his eyes. Not anger, not suspicion, but the kind of fear only a father feels when his child hovers at the edge of life. The sight struck the rancher like a blow. He had children of his own. He knew that terror, that helplessness, and in that moment, the wall between them, settler and Apache, felt thinner. Though the tension between them still hung like a blade, the night dragged on. But with it came more shadows moving across the land outside. The rancher glimpsed them through the window figures, watching from the distance, silent as the stars above. The tribe was gathering. By dawn, more would be there. He wondered how many, and what they would decide when they saw their injured boy inside a settler's home. Meanwhile, a different fear gnawed at him. What if word spread among the ranchers and cowhands nearby? They might not see the situation as he did. They might believe the Apache were planning an attack and ride out armed, ready for a fight. Two sides, bristling with weapons. Staring at each other across the plains, it would only take a single spark to ignite a war neither wanted but both. Fear that thought haunted him through the night. And when the first pale light of morning broke, the unease only deepened. More Apache had arrived, their figures cutting stark shapes against the horizon. They did not storm the cabin. They did not shout threats. They simply waited, a silent circle tightening around the rancher's world. Inside, the older man finally spoke to the others in a long, steady voice. The words carried weight, like decisions being shaped in the dark. The younger men responded with sharp tones, their frustration plain. Though the rancher could not understand their language, he could feel the conflict in the room. Some wanted vengeance. Some wanted restraint. And the boy's survival seemed to be the thread keeping that argument from snapping. The rancher thought about speaking, about offering words, but every time he opened his mouth, the weight of their stares silenced him. What could he say that would change what had happened? His actions, not his words, would decide this. Still, he felt a restless urge to explain, to tell them he wasn't their enemy, that he hadn't meant harm. But he also knew words could twist easily, could sound like excuses instead of truth. So he stayed quiet, his silence carrying its own kind of plea. As the day stretched on, the boy lingered in the space between life and death. His survival was uncertain, and with every labored breath, the tension in the room grew heavier. The older man rarely looked away from him, his expression carved from grief and hope in equal measure. And the rancher, though an outsider, found himself bound to the boy's fate just as tightly. The prairie outside remained quiet, but the quiet was deceptive. Both settlers and Apache lived on edge, distrust always close to the surface. The rancher knew that if this boy's death was laid at his feet, it could ignite something far larger than either side could control. The land had seen such violence before, and it could see it again. He felt as though every moment that passed pulled the knot tighter, a knot that might never be untangled. The sun dipped low again, shadows stretching long. The boy stirred once more, whispering something faint, his voice little more than a breath. The older man leaned close, listening, and for a heartbeat, a flicker of relief crossed his face. The boy lived still. That fragile thread had not yet snapped. But outside, more shapes gathered, more eyes fixed on the cabin. The rancher's world had become a fragile stage where every movement, every decision would be judged. He could sense the storm building, a storm of mistrust, fear, and anger. And though he had fought to keep the boy alive, he wondered if it would be enough. The silence outside deepened, and the cabin walls seemed to close in. The rancher felt the weight of many eyes on him, both inside and beyond the door. He knew the main conflict was no longer just about one mistake. It was about two worlds colliding, two people staring at each other across a chasm of fear and history. And in that fragile space, one boy's life, one accidental shot had become the center of everything, as darkness swallowed the prairie again. The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Would the boy's survival bring a chance for peace, or would his death unleash a tide that no man could stop? The rancher did not know. All he could do was wait, the weight of a storm pressing down on his shoulders. As the night settled in with its endless silence, the prairie was no longer quiet. By the third night, the land around the cabin was alive with whispers, shifting shadows, and the heavy presence of eyes that never blinked. More Apache had arrived, silent figures gathering in the dark. They did not storm the door, but their presence pressed against the cabin walls like a tide. Inside, the air was so thick with tension that even the crackle of the lantern felt deafening. The boy still breathed, but his breaths came shallow, each one sounding like it could be his last. His skin was pale, his lips dry, and the rancher's makeshift bandages were soaked through again and again. The older man, the one with gray in his hair, never left the boy's side. The younger men grew restless, their whispers sharp, their movements quick, their hands never far from the knives at their belts. The rancher could feel the conflict swirling between them. Some wanted blood right there and then. Others seemed to hold back, waiting for a sign. The boy's survival was the thread that held back a flood. If he lived, there was a chance, just a chance, that things might not collapse into violence. If he died, the land would drown in it. But there was another storm brewing. Out on the horizon, faint but clear, smoke trails curled into the sky. The rancher knew what it meant. Settlers had seen the gathering, or at least caught word of it. The neighbors' men who carried rifles as easily as shovels would not sit idle if they believed the Apache were preparing for war. They would ride. And if they rode toward this cabin, they would come with fear in their hearts and fingers on their triggers. The rancher's mind churned with dread. He had never felt more trapped. Inside, suspicion cut at him with every glance. Outside, danger swelled like thunderclouds. The cabin was no longer his home. It was a powder keg, every breath of wind threatening to set it off. The boy stirred again, his eyes half opening, his lips moving faintly. The older man leaned close, listening, and for the first time since that terrible day, a flicker of emotion broke through the stone mask on his face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't relief either. It was something harder to name, a recognition, maybe, that the boy still clung to life in spite of everything. The boy's words, too faint for the rancher to hear, seemed to hold weight. Because the older man straightened, his eyes darker than ever, and looked at him long and hard. The rancher felt exposed under that stare. He wanted to speak, to explain again, to say the words that burned inside him that he hadn't meant harm, that he'd done everything to save the boy, but the silence in the cabin swallowed every word before it could leave his lips, and then came the sound he dreaded most. Hoofbeats, distant at first, but steady, growing louder as they drew closer. The rancher's blood ran cold. The Apache turned sharply, their heads snapping toward the sound. The younger men muttered, their hands tightening around their weapons. They thought it 2 settlers were coming. The hoofbeats grew into a thunder, until shapes appeared on the far ridge. Riders. The rancher's worst fear was now real. Settlers armed and wary. Approaching the cabin that had become the center of 2 worlds colliding, the Apache inside the cabin moved toward the door. Their bodies tense as bowstrings. The older man barked a command, holding them back, his authority clear even in the thick haze of anger. But his eyes betrayed unease. He knew what the rancher knew. If those settlers and warriors came face to face outside this cabin, the land would ignite. The rancher's heart hammered. He could almost see it unfold in the settlers spotting the Apache. Rifles raised, shouts filling the air, arrows drawn in return. One spark, and everything would explode. He thought of his family, his neighbors, the boy lying weak in his bed. He thought of the land itself, soaked in the memories of battles fought before. Was history about to repeat itself, with his mistake as the match? The hoofbeats stopped. Silence again, but this time it was heavier, thicker, charged with the kind of tension that makes the skin prickle. The settlers had arrived. Their shapes lingered just beyond the ridge, watching, waiting inside. The Apache waited too. The older man's eyes cut to the rancher, sharp and searching. It was as if he was asking without words, "What will you do now?" The boy's life, the tribe's patience, the settlers' fear, all of it knotted together in that one question. The rancher swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had no plan, no promise. Only the knowledge that whatever he did in the next few moments would shape everything that came after. The cabin felt too small, the air too thin, the silence too loud. Outside, a horse snorted. A voice called out, sharp and wary, "You in there. You all right?" The settlers had spoken, and now there was no turning back. The world stood balanced on the edge of a blade, waiting to tip one way or the other. Inside, the boy stirred again, his breath rattling. Duh! His hand twitching weakly against the blanket. The older man leaned closer, his face a mask of turmoil. And then he looked again at the rancher, his eyes filled with something fierce and unspoken. The tension reached its peak. Settlers on one side, Apache on the other, the boy's life hanging in the balance, and the rancher caught in the middle with no escape. Every breath felt like the last calm before a storm that could not be stopped. What would happen next? No one in that cabin knew. Not the rancher, not the Apache, not the riders on the ridge. All they knew was that the moment had come, and when it broke, nothing would ever be the same again. The silence after the settler's voice cut through. The night was heavier than any sound. The rancher stood frozen, his breath shallow, his palms sweating as he stared at the Apache inside the cabin. They stared back, their eyes sharp, waiting. The older man, with streaks of gray in his hair, never moved from the boy's side, but his gaze burned into the rancher like fire. It was clear that what happened in the next few minutes would decide everything, life or death, peace or war. The rancher swallowed and stepped forward. His boots felt heavy against the wooden floor. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, and called out to the men outside. "I'm here. I'm alive. But you need to listen." His voice trembled, but he forced it steady. He knew that one wrong word could spark the chaos that waited like dry brush around a flame. From outside came a reply. "We've seen the smoke. Heard talk that Indians were gathered here. You in trouble?" The rancher glanced at the Apache men, at the boy fighting for breath on his bed. Trouble didn't even begin to cover it. He drew in a long breath. "Don't come closer, please. There's a boy inside. He's hurt, and I'm trying to make it right." There was a pause, and then muffled voices carried on the wind. The settlers outside were debating. He could hear the suspicion in their tones. One of them shouted, "You can't trust him." "You know what happens when they gather?" Another called, "Step away. We'll handle this." The rancher shook his head hard. He couldn't let them. He turned toward the Apache, and for the first time since they entered his cabin, he spoke directly to the older man, even knowing he might not understand a word. "I don't want blood. Not yours, not theirs. I didn't mean for this to happen, but I'll stand here, between them and you, if I have to." The older man's face did not soften, but there was a shift in his eyes. Something measured, something weighing more than anger alone. The boy stirred, whispering weakly in their language. And the older man leaned close, his features softening just enough to reveal the truth the rancher had suspected. This was his son. The hoofbeats outside grew restless. Horses snorted. The settlers were losing patience. Rifles would soon be raised. The rancher's heart hammered as he stepped outside onto the porch, his hands still raised. The sight of him made the settlers pause. Their rifles pointed but not yet fired. "There's no attack," the rancher said firmly, his voice carrying in the dry air. "There's no war being planned. There's a boy inside, and I'm the one who shot him." Gasps and curses broke from the riders. One spat in the dirt. "Then let us finish it," he snarled. "They'll kill you soon as look at you. You think they'll forgive?" The rancher shook his head, his voice hoarse but strong. "If I let you fire on them, the boy dies, and so does every chance we got to keep peace. They're here for him. That's all." He looked each of them in the eye, one by one. "I'll take the blame." "If you can't trust them, then trust me," the settlers muttered among themselves. Torn between suspicion and the uneasy respect they felt for the man standing before them. He was one of their own, after all, and they could see in his face that this was no trick. Finally, one of the older riders lowered his rifle first. "We'll wait," he said flatly. "But if they make one move, when we end it here." The rancher nodded, relief washing over him, though the danger was far from gone. He stepped back inside. The Apache eyes were still on him, but there was something different now. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. The older man turned his attention back to his son, speaking softly in their language. The boy's chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm. But there was a spark of life left. Through the next long hours, the settlers stayed outside, their silhouettes sharp against the night sky. Inside, the Apache remained by the boy's side, their silence heavy, but no longer charged with the same edge of violence. The rancher did what he could, changing bandages, cooling the boy's fever with damp cloths, offering water when he stirred. And every time the older man watched closely, noting each action by dawn. The boy's breathing had steadied, fragile, but stronger than before. When his eyes opened, truly opened for the first time since the shooting, a low murmur rippled through the Apache men. The older man let out a slow, heavy breath, one that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 fears. He touched his son's hand gently, then looked at the rancher again. This time his gaze held something new, acknowledgement. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The boy's survival spoke louder than anything else. The Apache gathered themselves. They lifted the boy carefully, wrapping him in blankets, preparing to carry him back to their people. The rancher stepped aside, his chest tight, knowing this was the moment that would decide whether he lived or died. The older man paused at the doorway. He looked at the rancher one last time, his eyes deep and steady. Then he gave the smallest of nods. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't friendship. But it was life. The Apache left, carrying the boy into the rising sun. Disappearing into the prairie's vast silence, the settlers outside stirred, their rifles still at the ready. But when they saw the boy alive, being carried away, their fury eased just enough. Some muttered curses, others spat in the dirt, but they did not fire. The rancher spoke quietly to them. "It's done. There's no war here. Go home." Slowly, reluctantly, they turned their horses and rode back, leaving the cabin standing alone once more. When the dust settled and silence returned, the rancher sank to the ground, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had not been killed. His family would be safe for now. But he knew the land was still fragile, the peace thinner than glass. One mistake, one careless shot, could still shatter it in the days that followed. The rancher returned to his work, but something in him had changed. Every rustle in the brush made him pause, not with fear, but with thought. Every shadow reminded him of the boy's pale face, the father's burning eyes. The knife-edge balance between trust and vengeance. He never forgot the sound of the hoofbeats, or the silence of the standoff. The boy lived. Word of that spread, quietly, carried by whispers rather than shouts. The tribe never came for vengeance, and the settlers never rode in for war. Life continued on the plains, but the memory of that night remained. It lived in the heart of the rancher and the scar of the boy, and in the silence between two peoples who had almost destroyed one another years later. When the rancher looked across the wide prairie, he thought often of the nod given to him at the doorway. A small gesture but heavy with meaning. It had saved his life. It had saved many lives. And though it did not erase the past or promise peace forever, it proved one truth that lingered with him always. Even in a land divided by fear, humanity could still reach across the line. The story of the rancher and the Apache boy became part of the quiet history of the frontier. One of those tales carried on the wind, told in low voices around fires. A reminder of how quickly trust can break, how easily violence can rise, but also how fragile acts of care can change the course of lives. The rancher never saw the boy again, but he never needed to. Knowing he lived was enough. Knowing that, for one night on the prairie, enemies had chosen restraint over blood was enough. And for the rest of his days, the rancher carried that night like a shadow and a light, both a warning and a lesson that in the hardest places, humanity is what holds the line between survival and ruin.